Hi everybody, this is Jennifer from Ferdalump, and this is a tutorial on how to make a zero that, like the one that I made that Lane wore with her Jack Skellington outfit. You'll need a minimal amount of sewing experience, and I made some out of just things that I had on hand. So I don't have a list to begin, but you pretty much craft supplies that you might have on hand. For the white fabric, I actually used the portion of a dust ruffle that goes underneath the mattress. And this isn't too scientific. I'm roughly just cutting out a square. You could also use a handkerchief that already has the edges finished, or you could use whatever polycotton, cotton blend, whatever white fabric that you happen to have on hand. As you see, I'm just kind of roughly cutting this into a square shape. Now it's up to you if you want to finish the edges or not. You can get a different kind of look if you want them to just look kind of wispy and ghost-like and whatever and have a raw edge. You certainly can do that. It just aesthetically, however it pleases you. For me, I'm going to go ahead and serge around the edges of the square and then do a narrow hem. If you want to avoid fraying, that's what I would suggest. Or you could actually just fold it over 1/4 of an inch and then fold it over again. That way you won't have to worry about any fraying. You could also use a fray check, or if it's a synthetic fabric, you could actually just singe the edges with fire. But you want to go ahead and press this so it's nice and flat. I always use spray starch because I'm an addict, and excuse my dirty ironing board there. I use a lot of spray starch and I need a new ironing board cover. But anyway, what I'm doing right here is just folding down the 1/4 inch hem around it. So I'm just going to stitch that down. Again, if you just want a raw edge around it, you can skip this step. Pretty simple though. There's your square. Okay, you're also going to cut another just remnant rough piece. This is just to make your head and your ears. So I like to press it just so it's nice and flat. As you can see, this is very, very rough. If you're going to make more than one of these, you might want to make a pattern for this head and the ears just so that they're the same size. But if you're just going to make one, you can just kind of draw on the fabric as I'm doing here. This kind of reminds me of a Swami Swan from the Lorax movie, but basically this is the neck and the head and his long nose, which kind of looks like a beak. So if you've got a water-soluble marker, you could, or even a pencil if you draw lightly, and you're just going to sketch your head. And as you see, the fabric is doubled there because you'll need 2 sides, each side of his head. And then you want to go ahead and cut that out. And you want to allow yourself as much seam allowance as you're going to stitch. So I take up a pretty small, about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance along the edge. And then you're also going to cut your ears. And because he's got 2 ears, you're going to need 4 pieces. 2 pieces for each ear. And again, you're just going to eyeball this piece, roughly drawing it, and you want to make it wide enough that you can actually turn these pieces if you're making a small one. You can use the idea of this to make a very large one if you wanted a large zero to go out in your yard or something like that. The idea is pretty much the same. You would just make larger pattern pieces. But you go ahead and cut those out. As I said, you're going to have 4 pieces for the ears, and you're going to have 2 pieces for his head. And then you can go ahead and stitch these. Now I like to make my stitches smaller because you're working in such a small thing. It's basically going to put the stitches closer together, because as you turn these pieces right side out, it's going to put a lot of stress on those smaller points, and you want the stitches to be closer together so you don't stab through them as you're turning. You also want to be careful not to stitch too close to the edge because you don't want the seam to pop open as you're turning it. When you've got all of these stitched around the edge, taking up whatever seam allowance you allowed yourself, you're going to need a little tool to turn these with. Depending on the size that you're making, you could use a small paintbrush, the blunt end. A lot of stuffing comes with a little turner or a little wood like chopstick, but you don't want anything with a sharp point because you don't want to jab through your fabric. So you just need something with a blunt end, and that's probably going to be your trickiest point, is turning those tiny pieces. Now what I'm doing here is I have a scrap piece of wire edge ribbon, so I'm just pulling out the wire so I can use that. You can also buy wire at your craft store, and depending on the size of your zero, You want a heavier gauge if you're making a larger zero with larger ears, but that's a very small bendable wire that I'm using there. And that's going to go inside of his ears. This is polyester stuffing, and you're going to use that to stuff his head. And you want to make sure that you stuff down inside his little snout, his little nose first, and get it nice and stuffed tight in there. So you want to use it, and whatever you can to get down in that nose. And again, that's going to be one of your trickier parts. But once you've got him nice and stuffed, you want to leave about 1/2 of an inch that's not stuffed there in his neck. For his ears here, you're going to go ahead and, I've got that clip in there twice, forgive me, but there's the wire that I showed you earlier. I'm pulling that out. And what you're going to do after you've pressed his little ears, you're going to take some wire, and you don't want to use your good sewing scissors. You can use craft scissors, or if you're using a heavier gauge wire, you can use wire snips. And you basically want to cut a piece of wire to go around the edge of his little ears there. And you just kind of bend that and eyeball the size. And what you're going to do is shove it up inside of his ear, and that's why you want the opening of the ear to be big enough. You feed the wire in there, and you want to make sure that the wire is hugging the outline of the ear. And then what you're going to do is go ahead and stitch that down on your machine, almost creating like a bunny ear, just to encase that wire on the outermost edge. So you're going to do that for both ears, and as you can see, it makes his ears bendable, so you can shape them however you want, and it kind of simulates that he's flying and ghost-like. So then what you do, as we said, we left the 1/2 inch or so of his neck unstuffed. You're going to go ahead and turn that raw edge in to make it nice and neat. You're going to take your square fabric that you finished the edges on, or if you left it raw, that's up to you, and you're just going to make a little cut with your scissors in the center. Just kind of eyeball it. It's not rocket science here. And you're going to go ahead and take his little neck and put it into the hole, and go ahead and stitch that closed. You can stitch this closed on your sewing machine, and or you could just hand sew it, or you could glue it if you wanted to. I usually put a little pin in there just to hold it, and go ahead and stitch that well, just so his head stays on his little ghost body. So that's what we're doing there. Go ahead and stitch him in place. And then once you've got that done, there's your little zero. He's got a head and a body now. So we're going to go ahead and attach his ears. And you're going to do this with hand stitching. You could glue it with hot glue if you wanted, but I usually like to hand sew it. And I like to tuck in the raw edge so you don't have any frays showing. You can just kind of turn the raw edge over. And I attach both ears at one time, stitching through his head to connect the ears onto his head. And you can just kind of eyeball the placement where you want his ears to go. So after you have stitched on his little ears back and forth, you want to make sure you tie off your stitching. And then you're going to take these little black beads. You could use whatever you've got handy. These were leftover beads from Lane's Titanic dress, and you want to use some black little eyes or beads or whatever to give him his little eyes. And again, I stitched both sides at one time, going through his head, and then knot him off to secure. And the next step would be optional if you want to give him his little mouth. I used some embroidery floss to give him a mouth. You could also use a black Sharpie marker, or you could use a very thin paintbrush and paint him one. Also, right here, as I'm actually going to his nose, I had some white pom-pom balls, and I just used an orange marker and colored a pom-pom orange with the marker. Or you could also use a little scrap of orange felt and make a little ball, which is what I did with some polyfill. Zero's nose is actually a little pumpkin, so you might be able to find a little craft pumpkin or make one out of clay, something like that. But basically just give him a little orange nose. Orange pom-pom balls are kind of hard to find, but you might luck out and find some at your craft store, especially if you're buying, you're making several, but you don't want to really buy a lot of things just for one orange pom-pom ball, so you might want to just make do. This particular one is the orange felt ball that I'm stitching onto this little guy. So he's got a nose and his two eyes, and I actually was already talking about his mouth, but next part is his mouth coming up. And again, I just used DMC floss, which is embroidery floss, to stitch his mouth, but you could use a Sharpie marker, you could use paint, or you could forego his mouth. I think on Lane's he didn't have a mouth. So that's up to you, however you want your little zero to look. But it's pretty simple. Just use, again, your needle and thread if you want to stitch him, embroider him a little mouth. So that's what I'm doing there. Again, this is a pretty basic project. It does use little odds and ends. You know, you may not want to go out and buy a whole thing of black beads and a whole thing of pom-pom balls to make 1 0. So you might want to just improvise with whatever you have around the house. You could actually paint his little eyeballs too if you wanted to. Just a little dollop, like a pinhead of black paint would be cute too. So then I'm just kind of showing you how you can accessorize him. In the movie, he has a red collar, so you could use a remnant of red ribbon. I kind of think the orange looks kind of Halloween-y, so you could make him a little collar or a bow out of orange ribbon. I like the look of a little bow on him. And then you can use zero however you want. You could glue him or stitch him onto a comb or an alligator clip or a barrette. You could also stitch or hot glue on a pin back and make him a little pin that you could wear on your shirt like I'm showing there. You could also put him on the headband like I did with Lane's. And I have a tutorial for a headband if you want to check out that, how to make a fabric headband. You could also use a headband that you find at the craft store or something like that. You could also use some ribbon or clear monofilament to make him an ornament and hang him from the tree. So that's how I made the zero. And I actually have a different option for you. Excuse my dog making crazy snoring noises. The next option is just a totally different way to make him. Some of the steps are the same, but basically you take a square of fabric, and this time we're going to leave the edges raw. We're not going to do any serging or stitching around the edges. And this is fabric stiffener. You can get this at Joann's or Michael's and Walmart even might carry it. And basically it makes fabric stiff. It's kind of like a glue. And I'm being very messy about it, just doing it right here at my craft room. But anyway, you just want to pretty much saturate the fabric, and do keep in mind that if you are using this on some fabrics like a satin or whatever, it will discolor the fabric. You will be able to tell. So always test if you're using a fabric you're not familiar with. But once you've got it nice and saturated with the stiffener, you're going to find something to position it on. To get a shape. I'm just using a glue bottle as you see, but you can use your imagination and kind of, you want it to shape how you want it to shape when it dries. And so this took about an hour to dry or so in front of a fan, and as you can see, it holds its shape. It's kind of like a little ghost. It's not super duper stiff. It would be more stiff if you used more stiffener, but I mean, it does still have some flow to it. So what I do is go ahead and make the same kind of head and the same kind of ears as you did. But this time you're not going to use the wire in the ears. I'm going to use the stiffener on the ears. We're not going to stiff his head at all, just stiffening his body and his ears. So this time I'm just going to put some of the stiffener in a bowl and just completely saturate his little ears in the glue. And I did tuck under the raw edges slightly. You want to work on a surface that the glue isn't going to stick to, the stiffener. So this is kind of like a little plastic mat. You could also use wax paper, but basically you just don't want it to dry and stick to it. And this is what you're going to shape the ears however you want. If you want them flat, that's fine. Or you can find something to kind of give them a little curve or a twist. I'm just taking 2 little tea lights here, and I'm just going to stack them up just so they'll dry with a little bit of a curve to it, but you can use your imagination and shape the little ears however you want. And while I'm waiting for that to dry, I went ahead and embellished, made his mouth, sewed on his little eyes, the little bead eyes, and gave him the pom-pom nose this time. What I did is I used a little clear rubber band to adhere the ears while they were wet to the little tea lights. And this is about an hour later, and as you see, they have dried stiff. So I took the rubber bands off, and as you see, they're standing upright. They're nice and stiff. There's no wire in these ears. These are just stiffeners. And you're going to go ahead and stitch them on as you did for the other zero. And once you've got them stitched on, that's what they're going to look like. Just like that. And then Lane's knocking on the door. She can't get out. So then you've got his little stiff body. You went ahead and cut a hole to put his neck down inside. Just like that. Now this time, because the fabric is stiff, you may not be able to get it under your sewing machine to stitch it, so I'm just going to hand stitch it closed. And when you're all done, I actually put a little red collar on him, just a little piece of red ribbon that I hot glued around his neck, and as you see, he stands up. and he holds his shape. So you could use him just as a decoration around the house. He's got his little ghost-like body that's nice and stiff. You could also add a piece of ribbon or something to him to make him a Christmas ornament, or if you made a bigger one, you could put him on your tree. You could also make a bigger one out of like weather-safe fabric, like kind of like flag material that's white, and that way it could be safe in your yard. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.